One of the biggest complaints that people have with Superman is that he's an overpowered Boy Scout, and while many competitors have made their own knockoffs to explore what that kind of strength would quote-unquote realistically do to someone, Marvel's attempt was a bit more interesting. The law of equivalent exchange states that in order to obtain, something of equal value must be lost. And in the case of the Sentry, his dark side makes sure to commit as much death and destruction as his alter ego prevents. But when you have the power of 1,000,000 exploding suns, is it worth saving the planet if those actions could just as easily lead to its entire annihilation? In order to keep everything that he knows and loves protected from his own monstrous power, the Sentry sealed himself away from not just the Marvel Universe, but also from the minds and memory of his real-world readers and creators, until one day, his original comics were discovered in the back of a dark Marvel office, and then suddenly, his presence and darkness were unleashed upon the universe once again. This is legitimately one of the most fascinating stories in all of comic history, as Marvel took the idea of forgotten memories and ran with it, going so far as to straight up lie to the media about their own history, and elevating the simple idea of what if Marvel had their own Superman into a thought-provoking story of mental health, addiction, and self-identity. Hello and welcome to Comic Drake, where I talk about comic books and my name is Drake. Let's talk about it. But before getting too far into things, I want to give a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Dave. See, some stuff has come up in my personal life lately that has impacted the amount of videos that I can make at the moment, and that means that money is a little bit tighter than usual. But thankfully, there's a banking app like Dave that's helpful for getting a little bit of cash right away. As a part of a Dave spending account, users are able to use the included extra cash feature to get up to $500 instantly with no interest, no late fees, and no credit check. To make things clear, Dave's extra cash is not a payday loan. It's an account that you can get in advance on that you pay back with no interest. All you're doing is getting a little bit of help from the future you, which means right now there's more money to fill your tank, catch up on bills, or get your car repaired without having to wait around for the next paycheck. Millions have already gotten the help they need with extra cash, and you can too by downloading Dave today at dave.com/comicdrake. Once again, that's dave.com/comicdrake. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Eligibility criteria and instant transfer fees apply. Banking services provided by Evolve, member FDIC. Because the Sentry is such a complicated character both behind the scenes and in continuity, I've enlisted the help of my good friend Owen Likes Comics to help keep things on track. So Owen, how did we get here?
If I were to tell you that Marvel were about to go out of business, there's a fair chance you probably wouldn't believe me. But if we were having this conversation in the mid to late 1990s, there was a genuine possibility that this was going to happen, that this company that had been around for decades and spawned so many beloved characters was about to completely cease to exist. Now, there are a lot of factors that caused this, from the collapse of the speculator market, the disastrous purchase of distributor Heroes World in 1994, and internal disagreements between the company's executives. But what's important to note in relation to the Sentry is that by 1998, the company was only just starting to recover. As Marvel regrouped, desperate to revitalize its sales and develop new cutting-edge titles to regain interest with readers, they quickly devised a plan: hire two rising stars within the industry and have them take over writing and editing some of Marvel's less popular characters, in the hope that they could turn them into the next best-selling comic series. These two individuals were Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti, who together co-founded the independent publisher Event Comics 4 years earlier. Accepting Marvel's offer, Quesada and Palmiotti launched Marvel Knights, a new publishing initiative that showcased characters like Daredevil, Black Panther, and the Inhumans, and provided distinctly darker and more mature stories than seen in your usual Marvel titles. For instance, the Daredevil series written by Kevin Smith not only saw Matt Murdock's long-standing love interest Karen Page be killed by Bullseye, but it also saw him throw a baby he believed to be the Antichrist off a building, because comics. Perhaps the most relevant of these launch books, though, was The Inhumans. Written by Paul Jenkins with art by Jay Lee, this 12-issue limited series became one of the most acclaimed and popular Marvel Knights titles, revitalizing The Inhumans and even winning the Best New Series awards at the 1999 Eisners. Jenkins and Lee quickly became two of the hottest names in the industry as a result of The Inhumans' success, whilst Marvel Knights continued to grow and expand over the next few years. But although characters like the Punisher, Doctor Strange, Black Widow, and even Spider-Man were all introduced into the imprint, Marvel editorial pushed for new and original characters to be created under the Marvel Knights banner. The first hero to debut in a Marvel Knights comic was the aptly named Marvel Boy, created by Grant Morrison and J.G. Jones, but he wasn't the only one. You see, during his time working at DC, Paul Jenkins became fascinated with a Golden Age superhero known as Hourman, who took a pill that would give him superpowers for 60 minutes. Jenkins contemplated how this premise could be used to tell a modern-day story about addiction, eventually pitching this idea to DC as a possible series for the Vertigo imprint. DC unfortunately turned this pitch down, and as a result, Jenkins began reworking the concept into an original character called the Sentinel. However, the sudden rise of Marvel Knight made him consider if this character could exist within the Marvel universe. Going back to the drawing board, Jenkins took the idea to artist Rick Veitch, who suggested that the character could be introduced as a forgotten piece of Marvel's history, a titan of the Golden Age of comics who had somehow been erased from existence. Veitch explained how this idea came to be, writing on his website that,
"It was this close as you can get it mimicry approach that I wanted to bring to Sentry, creating a false history of the character with versions going back to timely comics in the 1940s. Paul liked the idea but wondered how we could explain the character's absence in 60 years of company continuity. That's when the light bulb went on. I'm quite sure it was my suggestion that something so horrible happened to the Sentry that all memory of the event and Sentry himself had to be wiped out, probably by some Marvel character on the scale of the Watcher. Right there, Paul and I knew we had it. Sentry's quest for a return of his memories and powers, a solution for his absence in Marvel continuity, and motivation for an attack by his own unconscious."
With Inhumans being such a critical darling, Joe Quesada greenlit the project, but he wanted to put together a brilliant marketing stunt to really capture the attention of the comic book community. Because the Sentry was supposedly a long-lost Golden Age character inside of the Marvel Universe, wouldn't it be interesting if he had actually been a Stan Lee creation that was lost and forgotten about in the real world as well? Jenkins initially wasn't on board. He was a horrible liar and didn't like the idea of deceiving his audience, but through persistent pestering, he was eventually won over. Jenkins and Quesada approached Stan Lee with the idea, and he was very much on board, applauding the creativity of the scheme and being happy to lean into his reputation of forgetfulness and eagerness to take credit for basically anything. By taking the names of two of Marvel's earliest letterers, Artie Simek and Sam Rosen, Jenkins and Quesada fabricated an artist named Artie Rosen who had supposedly worked alongside Stan Lee in the early days of Marvel Comics, or as it was known back then, Atlas. To really help sell the idea, the duo enlisted the help of the legendary artist John Romita Sr. to become the ghost artist and draw up Rosen's work by perfectly emulating the art style of the era. With their team now assembled, Marvel began planting the seeds of their deception by first referencing Artie Rosen in the letter pages at Daredevil, wishing the influential artist the best as he had apparently fallen ill. This was followed up half a year later with the popular comic magazine Wizard being brought in to report on Rosen's passing, acknowledging his large body of uncredited work from Marvel alongside a mournful quote from Stan Lee. The following month, Wizard announced that Marvel had come across some long-lost sketches of a Stan Lee superhero that predated the Fantastic Four. The details about this unearthed relic were vague and pretty hush-hush, but 1 month later, the magazine followed up with a detailed tell-all. When clearing out her late husband's effects, Rosen's widow found a box labeled Marvel Comics that she sent back to the company's office. But despite this coming from one of their most important artists of all time, nobody at Marvel actually opened the box up. Well, one night, Jenkins supposedly stumbled across it while looking for something to read on his way home, and that's when he unearthed the Sentry. Now, Jenkins has admitted multiple times that he really doesn't know all that much about comic history, with him famously taking on the Inhumans without knowing who they were, and wrote his entire series after only reading 5 issues. After flipping through some of these old Sentry comics, Paul thought that this guy would be a prime candidate for the Marvel Knights treatment, but when trying to learn more about the hero, nothing came up. He went and talked to other people around the Marvel office about the Sentry guy, and they didn't know anything either. But seeing Stan's name on all of the work, Quesada decided to give him a call and try to get more information himself, but Lee said that he only had the slightest recollection about it. Nevertheless, he gave Marvel his full blessing to bring the Sentry into the modern era and wished them luck with their new project. Now, you have to remember that all this happened in the year 2000, and widespread internet usage was far from common, so there were absolutely fans that fell for this prank. Although, the cat was nearly out of the bag since Jenkins wasn't the most convincing at comic conventions, because he wasn't all that great of a liar, and he instead let Quesada do most of the talking. Regardless, the hype was palpable, and when the Sentry #1 hit the stands 2 months later, it sold a respectable number of units for a new character, by being the 20th best-selling issue that month. As for the story itself, well, that's where things truly got interesting.
The Sentry's initial 5-issue limited series ran from July to October of 2000, with each issue written by Paul Jenkins, with art by Jay Lee and Jose Villarrubia. It begins with a sudden flash of lightning, startling and waking up the middle-aged and mild-mannered Robert Reynolds. As Robert wakes up, he immediately realises that something is wrong, walks downstairs and grabs a book with a mysterious formula inside it. Here, we learn this isn't just an ordinary man, as once he takes the serum, Robert transforms into the Sentry. Through flashbacks, it's explained that Sentry was the most powerful hero in the Marvel Universe, and frequently fought alongside the Avengers, Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four. This is all demonstrated visually by depictions of the Sentry in different art styles from comic history, from the classic 1960s Jack Kirby look, to mirroring Frank Miller's Batman in The Dark Knight Returns, to the hyper-stylized pocket and pouches designs of the 1990s. As Robert processes these memories, he witnesses a terrifying vision of his longtime foe, the Void. Shaken, Reynolds knows what he must do: solve the mystery behind his disappearance and unite his fellow heroes to prevent the Void from destroying the world. Sentry first travels to the Baxter Building, where we learn that he and Reed Richards were once best friends. Reed, not recognizing the mysterious figure, urges Robert to leave. Before he does though, Sentry tells Mr. Fantastic to look for the unicorn, and later, Reed notices a unicorn ornament in his living room, causing him to remember Bob's wedding where he was his best man. Reed also finds a tape containing a pre-recorded message from himself, alerting him that if this is being played, it means that the Sentry has returned and that the Void will soon follow. Whilst the Fantastic Four prepare for what comes next, we see Robert encounter several other heroes, including the Hulk, the X-Men and Spider-Man. One by one, each character begins to remember the Sentry and their battles together. When Robert meets Iron Man though, he discovers something truly shocking. Tony recalls a meeting that he and the other heroes had after an unnamed incident, where they collectively decided to erase the world's memory of the Sentry. Believing that his closest friends betrayed him, Robert heads to his old base of operations, the Watchtower. However, when attempting to access his onboard computer, he finds that he's been locked out by none other than Reed Richards. Sentry deduces that Reed was the one who orchestrated the conspiracy to erase his memories, becoming overwhelmed with rage that causes thunderstorms in the night sky, and it's through these thunderstorms that the Void can be seen as chaos begins to break out across the city. Robert races to the Statue of Liberty, where he's met by all the other heroes he's encountered previously, including Mr. Fantastic. As they all prepare to battle the Void, Robert confronts Reed over his betrayal, before Doctor Strange appears and reveals a memory that neither man could recall. It's explained that the Void is actually an alternate persona of the Sentry, a manifestation of all of his trauma and addiction, and fearing that he could no longer contain his light and dark elements, Robert instructed his fellow heroes to wipe his memory and make the entire world forget his existence in order to prevent the Void from ever re-emerging. We see that Reed, torn over the loss of his closest friend, was the one who built a machine that did this, and realizing this is the way that they can defeat the Void, Robert and Reed rush back to the Watchtower and activate the machine. In their final moments together, Sentry apologizes for ever coming back, as Mr. Fantastic tells his former best friend that he was the best man he ever knew, and the real tragedy wasn't his return, but the fact the world had to lose the Sentry again. The two men say goodbye, and the comic suddenly fades to black. The next thing we see is the wrecked streets of New York City, accompanied by a news bulletin stating that a hurricane had rampaged through the streets the previous night. Inside of a car, we see Robert and his wife Linda Reynolds listening to the report before pulling over outside a fast food restaurant. Robert enters and is met by a familiar face, his former sidekick Billy, aka Scout. Much like the other heroes from earlier though, Billy doesn't recognise the Sentry at all, and instead asks to take his order, causing Robert to smile, leaving the fate of the Sentry and the entire world uncertain.
The Sentry very much reads like a one-off alternate universe comic, but that wasn't necessarily the intent. Although it was generally well-liked, the book's respectable 20th place wasn't enough to make Marvel's Golden Guardian the next big thing. There was also a general disinterest from writers at the time from using recently created characters in their work that they didn't make themselves. However, Marvel's newest hotshot writer, Brian Michael Bendis, was a huge fan of what Jenkins and Lee had put together, and firmly placed the Sentry into the main Marvel comics as a central part of his revitalization of the Avengers, opening with the reveal that Bob was in prison for supposedly killing his wife. Something that's odd considering that nobody in the superhero community had ever heard of the Sentry, and Bob's wife was very much still alive. After helping the Avengers stop a breakout, Reynolds fled to the desert, isolating himself in fear that by using his powers again, he risked unleashing the Void. And from there, the comic retreads a lot of the ground that was already explored in the original miniseries, with the Marvel Universe having forgotten all about him and all the heroes starting to remember him bit by bit. But on top of that, Bob suffers from severe memory loss and schizophrenia, which puts both the planet and himself in danger as he loses control of his powers over to the Void. Things were able to settle down though thanks to Emma Frost stitching his memories back together, but Bob's schizophrenia persisted, leading to the Avengers offering him a place on their team as a way to keep an eye on him. Readers loved this first storyline, especially since most hadn't read Jenkins' original series and were being exposed to the idea of a long-forgotten superhero for the first time. Plus, it didn't hurt that the first thing he did was fly Carnage to space and rip him in half, which is pretty fucking sick. The newfound popularity of the character gave Jenkins the opportunity to write a second Sentry miniseries which dove into Bob's true origin, and it's revealed that he was actually a drug addict that came across the serum that turned him into the Sentry after breaking into a lab in search of something that could get him high. The series also intimately deals with the relationship between Bob's two sides in a very interesting way, heavily implying that the Void is his true form and that it's the Sentry who is the offshoot personality. It is an extremely good read that was meant to be a middle entry in a trilogy, but sadly, Jenkins would never get the opportunity to write his final series. A reason for that could be that during Bendis' nearly decade-long run of the Avengers, the Sentry was a central character, but he became controversial as time went on. Some didn't like that he was made more powerful to a truly ludicrous degree, such as when it was revealed that he could manipulate molecules better than Molecule Man himself, a dude that is so powerful that he can erase Galactus with a single thought. It also frustrated plenty of readers that because of his sheer amount of power, the Sentry could never be utilized in big comic events, with him always being written out because of his agoraphobia or being easily scared off by the Skrulls. And whenever he did show up, it was essentially to act as a big deus ex machina. Others, however, really liked the back and forth with his struggles with the Void, especially when he was a member of the Dark Avengers and was manipulated by Norman Osborn, who acted like a friend that understood the complications of having an evil voice inside your head. Bendis' time with the Sentry ended during the Siege of Asgard, when Norman had him unleash the Void to obliterate the home of the gods, with them ultimately being taken out by Thor and laid to rest inside of the sun itself after he reverted back to normal Bob and begged for death so that he could no longer be a threat to anyone. Of course, though, dying means nothing in comic books, and the Sentry was resurrected as a horseman of death, but he got better and then was recruited by Doctor Strange to fight Loki, who would become the Sorcerer Supreme, because comics. Then he got a legitimately fantastic miniseries by Jeff Lemire that, on top of being a kick-ass action book, has a lot of elements that call back to Miracle Man, a highly important figure in the comic industry that I dove into in my award-winning video. This Sentry comic absolutely rules, and as much as I would love to get into it, it really deserves its own dedicated video. But by the end of it, Bob merges with the Void and runs off to space. In another book, though, he separates from the Void for like the 5th time in his publication history, only to merge back with it by the end of the book. Then he got killed in a big event, comes back as a zombie or something, and then was killed off at the end of that series. Don't get me wrong, some of the later books that Bob was in are really great reads, but they're just not the best uses of the Sentry, and it really seems like Marvel doesn't know what to do with him. When done right, the Sentry is a truly fascinating character that gives an avenue to explore addiction and mental health, but he's so often stripped down to just being a super strong guy that punches really hard, which is a role that can be easily fulfilled by any of Marvel's other Superman stand-ins. Marvel Knights was all about taking brand new or unpopular characters and telling new types of stories with them that stood apart from what the company was putting out at the time, and it really sucks that these days, there seems to be no structured vision for what the Sentry should be, and instead he's going through the same story beats over and over and over again. But luckily there's a new series coming out a few months after this video that's looking to shake things up, and it's our hope that they'll be able to do something great with the Sentry concept, which really plays to the character's strength of emotional storytelling, but of course, only time will tell. I want to give a big thank you to Owen for helping out with this. He has a huge video all about the history of Marvel Knights, so definitely go check that out if you want more information, and be sure to leave a comment telling him that I sent you. I also want to give a big shout out to A Better Place. They compiled a lot of the details and screenshots of this story, and they were an invaluable resource. But anyway, I hope you learned at least a little something new, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.